I want to talk about the history. I think that would be super fun to explore. There's so much here to unpack. So just take us back. Like, how did astrology, or tell us a little bit about kind of when when did astrology first emerge, and kind of how did astrology used to be used among just like lay people in general, and then we can talk about obviously how the church used or didn't use it. So let's just take us back to like um, the earliest records of like astrology.
Yeah, totally. I think that it's so interesting how we think that these topics are new age. Like we think that these things have just appeared on the scene, that it's just been the last,
Yeah.
100 years or whatever. But actually, a lot of these practices are ancient practices. And so, I mean, when it comes to astrology, what I have found is that the best analogy for astrology is language. Astrology developed in a very similar way as language develops. It developed very slowly over time, over thousands of years. We actually have evidence of astrology being practiced all the way like 15,000 years ago. Potentially even more than that, but hard evidence, at least 15,000 years. We have cave paintings in France that show the constellations of Pleiades in in the shape of a bull. Like they made, and Pleiades is in the zodiac sign of Taurus, right? So 15,000 years ago, they were painting
Cool.
the Pleiades constellation on caves in the form of Taurus, right? In the sense of history, right? So documented history that we can actually go back and look at what they were saying. We know that astrology became very prominent in Mesopotamia about 4,000 years ago. So we're talking about like 2000 BCE. And that's really when we start seeing like kind of these cuneiform tablets with charts, with descriptions, books with descriptions of the zodiac sign and these astrological predictions. At that time, what they were practicing was mundane astrology. So mundane astrology is the astrology of the world, right? The nations, states, and kings. Okay. And that's what astrology was for. They started making correlations, in particular when it came to eclipses, and they started seeing, okay, when an eclipse happens in this part of the sky, our king dies. When an eclipse happens in that part of the sky, we have a foreign invader. And that's kind of how eclipses became associated with a bad omen. Again, we started 15,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. Astrology was actually more state sponsored because it was in the government's best interest to know what was going on with the stars, in particular, if it involved foreign enemies invading, if it involved death of the kings. You have to remember, like life was so volatile back then. Like people didn't live as long. If a plague came through, it would wipe out your children and half your family, right? Like, I mean, these were life and death situations that people were experiencing on a regular basis. And so they were paying attention. And so there were state sponsored, colleges of astrology that would give reports to the king. And then eventually, uh, so in the fourth century BCE, we have first evidence of the first natal chart, right? And it was very simple. It was just kind of this description of like where the planets were at the moment of someone's birth. But that's when natal astrology became popular, and people started to realize that the moment of someone's birth could give an indication to who they would become and the type of life that they were going to have. And you have to remember, again, these were pagans who were practicing astrology. And again, it was all over the world. There is evidence of astrology in the Americas. There's evidence of astrology in Egypt, in the Middle East. There's evidence of astrology in Europe for sure, with the Celtics and the Druids. They were actually excellent astrologers. To be a Druid priest in kind of Northern Europe, it was 20 years of training.
Wow.
A 20-year, and it was all oral tradition. They had an alphabet, but they kept it as an oral tradition. 20 years of training to be a Druidic priest. So they were known for being excellent astrologers. And then of course we have Chinese astrology, we have Indian astrology. So isn't that interesting? Right? Like we have astrology, evidence of astrology in all different parts of the world, and we have evidence that they spoke with each other, right?
Mhm.
And so one thing that I found particularly interesting is that in the Druidic culture, the word for Mercury is Bud, B-U-D-H, right, which is the foundational word for Buddha.
Yeah.
And in Indian astrology, the word for the planet Mercury was Bud, B-U-D-H, like the same word for
Wow.
Mercury, in two completely different cultures that we didn't even realize spoke to each other, right? And so clearly there's an exchange of information. Clearly they're all seeing and practicing the same things, right? And of course there are differences, but even the Australian Aborigines practice astrology and have, records of an astrological language. So we think about this, worldwide kind of ascent, an attempt to communicate with God. Um, it's truly, I think it's beautiful. And so from there, astrology continued to evolve. Um, After the fall of the Roman Empire, the Arabs took over, right? So the Arabic Empire was almost as big as the Hellenistic Empire with Alexander the Great. So it spread, from Iraq all the way down into northern Africa, all the way up into the Iberian Peninsula. And so they kind of adopted the Hellenistic tradition of astrology and made it their own. And finally, when in the Middle Ages, when Europe, in Spain, when the Iberian Peninsula Europeans started pushing down into the Islamic Empire, they got access to all of these libraries and all of this incredible, scientific knowledge, medical knowledge that the Islamic Empire had held for so long. And so that's when, we kind of see this increase of interest in astrology. Hildegard of Bingen writes about astrology. Thomas Aquinas writes about astrology. And it really became, there was a resurgence of interest in astrology ages as a legitimate science. Because before that, in the ages, and even the Roman Empire, I mean, again, we have to remember, like, the Roman Empire was vicious. It was actually like legal to torture and kill slaves in the Roman, like in your household, right? In the Roman Empire. I mean, they were horrific. Lots of human sacrifice. Obviously, we know about the gladiators and all of that. It was an incredibly violent culture, pagan culture. And so, Christians really associated astrology with that type of divination, right? Um, which again was just incredibly destructive. But, again, because it was still being used in other parts of the world for various ways of using astrology, it found its resurgence in the Middle Ages as a legitimate science. It was very closely tied with astronomy. And so, yeah, even the Vatican was built according to an astrology chart, the
Yeah.
cornerstone of St. Peter's
Yeah, I was
Basilica.
gonna say, like, I love, love, love this like timeline of history, and I like want to zoom in on a couple of things that you said that like you've touched on, but like I think would be really fascinating to like dive deeper into is like, um, some well, one specific question that came to me is like there are records, there are reports of specifically like church leaders, right? And um yeah, church leaders and even like the Pope, right? Utilizing astrology and referencing astrology. Could you talk maybe a little bit about like, yeah, I mean, you've already started to give some examples of like how they used it. But I'm curious too, how do you think, or is there record of like how they kind of reconciled using astrology like with their faith like many 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 years ago, right? Like did that seem problematic, right, to them? Did they feel like they had to justify or explain, or was it very secret, right? I'm just thinking nowadays, if like a priest came to a town and they're like, okay, like, a diocese is like, hey, we want to start a church, like, where's the best ground? Like, let's reference astrology, like, let's find the natal chart for this church that we want to break ground on. Like, that would not be okay, right? And so I'm curious, digging just a little deeper in that, like, did church, I mean, we know church leaders used astrology, but maybe how? And do you feel like they had to reconcile it anyway? And like, where has that been lost in time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so the fact of the matter is that astrology, again, it is like this language that just won't go away, right? And so it has always kind of like hung out under the surface and had its resurgence in various cultures across the world. Regarding the Christian church, so astrology was denounced by the early church. Again, it was seen as this kind of pagan practice. St. Augustine, gave many arguments against astrology. But one thing that he did say was that it's not absurd to think that the heavenly bodies could be reflecting or have some sort of influence upon the earth, right? Even back then, we already knew that women's cycles were closely correlated to the moon. Planting and harvesting crop cycles were closely correlated with the moon. And so he said, it is not absurd to think that the heavenly bodies could impose some influence on the earth. He said, however, that is not how astrologers normally talk. So he was really specifically referencing this sort of fate versus free will opposition that was happening between pagan religions and Christianity. Christianity super emphasizes free will. God, created us with a will. We can make our own choices, and created us to subdue the earth, to subdue nature, right? As being, in some ways more powerful than that of nature. And so pagan societies really bought into this concept of fate, and that like it is the will of the gods, and that we are kind of fated for the life that we're fated for. I think that's how they really justified a lot of the horrors they committed. And so it was this kind of contentious relationship. Again, moving into the Dark Ages, people were in Europe. Okay, so we're really focusing on Western astrology in this conversation, because that's kind of our purview. In the Dark Ages, the majority of the population was mostly illiterate, and so astrology is a very complicated science, or complicated practice, right? And it requires a really incredible knowledge of the stars, of mathematics, and especially if you're drawing out charts by hand and creating these ephemeries, so these charts for the future, casting charts for the past, tracking stars, and just that ability to track their movements. It was all very sophisticated, and so for the most part, we don't see that happening in Europe. We do see that happening in the Islamic Empire, and then of course in Asia. Kind of separated on its own, but there was some interface between the two cultures, because we do see similarities at various periods of time. But I mean, it's amazing that we don't study the age of Islam more in school. It's actually a tragedy, because they were so advanced. Their science, their medicine, it was just, it was incredible. And so they were the ones that really held on to the astrological tradition during the Dark Ages. And then again, it gets its resurgence in the Middle Ages. And it was used, so Hildegard of Bingen wrote extensively on healing modalities of the Middle Ages. So for those who don't know, Saint Hildegard of Bingen is a doctor of the Catholic Church. She's a saint, and she was this Renaissance woman before the Renaissance, right? She composed music. She was a healer. She was a nun. She founded orders. She really she wrote books. Just this incredible woman of her time, right? And so she was known as a healer. And so she talks about, when children are conceived, during this phase of the moon, they're going to be like this when they're conceived at that phase of the moon, right? And she talks a lot about the stars again, and Thomas Aquinas says this too. It's this idea that they have an influence, but it's nothing that is overwhelming. They influence us in the same way that whether or not the day is hot or cold influences us, right? Like it's going to influence what we do. Maybe it'll influence what we wear, right? But it's nothing that is, going to be contrary to our free will, right? And we can talk more about whether or not the stars actually influence us. I don't actually think that they do in that, but that's what they believed. Going into the Middle Ages, the truth of the matter is that the church, the magisterium of the church at that time became increasingly corrupt. There was a lot of nepotism. There was a lot of, the fact of the matter is that absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? I wish I could give credit for that quote, but I can't remember. I'll put it down in the show notes. But it's true. So the church really did have absolute power in the Middle Ages, and there was quite a bit of corruption in the church. And so with that being said, the church was using astrology fairly significantly, and I think in a lot of places it took the place of God, which is always the danger when it comes to astrology, right? And so something called horary astrology was incredibly popular during the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and even into the Enlightenment, which is a type of astrology where when you ask a question of an astrologer, the moment that the question is asked, they pull a chart for it, and then the idea is that in that chart there's insight into the question to the answer. And so, horary astrology is what's used when you are trying to, or horary astrology and elective astrology, which is another form of astrology, is used when you're trying to figure out the right day to do something, right? Like what's a good day to get married? What's a good day to, and that's all very predictive. That is not an enlightened use of astrology at all. But the church used it that way. And so again, the cornerstone of St. Peter's Basilica was laid according to an astrological chart that had been pulled on an auspicious, day. And the church has had this kind of push-pull relationship with astrology because, on the one hand, we have incredible saints and doctors of the church who have recognized its benefits and its uses. And of course, again, anyone who's lived in an agrarian society, anyone who, gardens or plants or reads the Farmer's Almanac knows that the earth is related to the universe that it belongs to, right? And that there are moments to plant and moments to harvest according to the season. But it's also so easily abused, right? And as human beings, we want to know the future, we want control over the future, and so it's so easy to get predictive, right? But then, of course, the Protestant Reformation happened, and I think at that point, between the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, and really just this recognition in the church that it just can't go on like this. I mean, priests had wives, priests or mistresses,
Yeah.
there were land grabs and power grabs within the church. There was a lot of nepotism in the church, a lot of buying of offices, right? And there was just so much corruption. And there had been reformers in the church over hundreds and hundreds of years who had tried and had made changes. And we did have, I mean, there was still that apostolic tradition. It was still the Holy Roman Catholic Church. And we have amazing saints from those times. But when it comes to the leadership of the church, they were really taken to task for the abuses that they had allowed. And so, which is not unlike, the church, what the church has experienced recently when it comes to the abuses that they allowed with their priests. And so, really, I think there was a lot of embarrassment within the church. And I think the Protestant Reformation uh, in many ways put the church to shame in the sense of the theological illiteracy of the church. Now we have the Gutenberg press, we have the printing press. Now people are able to read the Bible for themselves, right, rather than relying on priests. And I mean, again, for like there was no standardized seminary formation, okay, until like a couple hundred years ago, right? And so some priests actually didn't know the Bible, actually didn't know, right? And so I think the church was really taken to task for this lack of education, this again standardized education, because I don't want to give any false pretenses that the church was not educated. I mean, founded Oxford University, founded the university system in general. Incredible sciences, scientists come from the church, male and female. But again, I'm talking about your average lay person, highly likely to be in a diocese where the bishop didn't even live in the diocese. The priest was overwhelmed, overworked, poor, underpaid, and probably also had mistresses, right? And like there was just such little education. Maybe oftentimes didn't even have an opportunity to go to mass on Sunday, right? Like that was your average illiterate layperson in Europe in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. So where did they go, right? They went to their local astrologer, their local healer, the person who was there, right? Who was there for them. And that's what people did. After the Enlightenment, you have this increase in education and literacy, and then you also have this increase in cynicism, right? And so all of a sudden, science becomes the religion. All of a sudden, it's what can be proven, what can be observed, what can we see. The scientific method, becomes the kind of the end all be all. There's this huge antagonism towards centralized power, right? And so at that point, astrology kind of descends and becomes considered like one of those pseudosciences, right?
Answered one of my questions, but like I wanted to, one of my questions initially was, and maybe you could talk about this a little bit more, because I think that this concept is still very much alive today, where like this separation between astrology and astronomy, and you already kind of talked about like the Latin roots of that, right, and like what they actually mean, but maybe we can like double click into that a little bit of like you said, astrology kind of turned into this like pseudoscience, just kind of like, yeah, no longer really trusted, and or just there was a lot of skepticism around it, and then literally the church like denouncing it completely, right? But if you ask someone even today, like, like everyone knows their sun sign, right? If you say like, what's your sign, right? Everyone knows what their own sign is. And so it's like, it almost has become a little bit of, very poppy, more like a pop culture, just kind of like a silly, and we've talked about this before, like almost just like a little personality, like test that you can just write down and, share with people. But, astronomy is still very much practiced, right? And very, I think praised, right? If someone says like I study astronomy, we are like, wow, that is absolutely incredible, right? Just the reputation of that. But if you walk up to someone and whether they're a Christian, whether they're Catholic or any other religion or agnostic or anything, right? And you say that you study astrology or are an astrologer, an astrologist, there's like a little, there's a little hint of skepticism. And a lot of people maybe are very curious, like people listening to, your work, Janelle, but a lot of people have a lot of, it feels like cringy compared to esteemed, like you're, an astronomer. So like maybe take us through that differentiation a little bit and kind of that separation that's impacted maybe how we view and utilize or don't astrology.
Totally. I mean, Rachel, I think that we live in a society that really worships the logic, right? We worship science. We worship this kind of stoicism. It's a worship of this hyper productivity, right? And so we see that in every facet of life. We see that in, again, our insistence on being logical and being stoic, and kind of our intuition has been cast to the side, and our emotions are seen as weakness. And I think that there's a huge loss there. But the fact of the matter is that astrology is not a science. There is some scientific evidence for the celestial planets having an impact on us. The moon affects the tides. We are 70% water. There is some evidence that storms on Jupiter causes, and I will link this in the notes below. Storms on Jupiter cause solar flares on the sun. Well, we know there is also evidence, but the thing is, it's all separate studies. You have to be kind of well in it all. Solar flares cause behavioral changes in human beings on Earth, right? Because they affect us, right?
Yeah.
And so, and solar flares also affect the Schumann resonance on Earth, which affects our behavior. So what does that mean? Jupiter affects us, right? Jupiter affects our behavior, right? If you're putting it all together, but we don't do that. Why? Because it's a pseudoscience, right? So let's set it aside and let's just say astrology is not scientific, right? Because it could not be, right?
Right.
The fact of the matter is that it really doesn't matter if it's scientific or not, because the way that we should be looking at astrology, which is what I advocate for, is as a language and as a calendar, right? But because we don't know astrology to be as a language, as a calendar, we, even astrologers themselves do all the rest of us a disservice by insisting that it's impacting us, by insisting that astrological predictions are valid, right? Even though even mundane astrologers will say that we're terrible at making predictions astrologically. I think by astrologers insisting that it's a science, we're doing ourselves a disservice because it's not. And so astrology and astronomy really shouldn't even be in the same category. But again, we live in a society that kind of worships this idea of knowledge. And again, it worships the idea of a knowledge acquired through experiments that can be repeated, right? Like through the scientific method.
Well, because humans have felt so out of control.
Right.
Like it's
exactly. Exactly. This is our new form of magic and divination. Our new form of magic and divination is the scientific method. And the fact of the matter is that the most important things that we can know as human beings can't actually be known through the scientific method.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Which is why, like, as you're talking, I would love to have like seen or just like have a glimpse into like ancient cultures and just like how much they just had to surrender, even if they didn't know God or have a word for God or have teachings about God, right? Like they were truly surrendering to his will and what was, and they were trying to communicate with him, right? And, we're trying to control things to an extent so that they could survive. But it was just like so, and again, like I'm very much like over generalizing this, but it seems compared to our society today where we have so many facets that we can control and our hands in everything, right? It's like these ancient societies had to just fully surrender to what is and trust and believe and just like take it one step one day at a time while having like some understanding of like planning for the seasons for the all of that. But yeah, I love everything that you shared about that. And I think that there's so much to be learned. Like no one studies this, right? Which is why like the work that you're doing is so important, because if people want proof, right? That's what people want, right? We live way more in a I'll believe it when I see it kind of world, right? Whereas in previous societies, they really did have to believe it first, right, in order to create, because they just didn't have the tools or the resources or knowledge. And yeah, I think it's beautiful that we can blend science, but I also think that bringing those. I have a friend who refers to astrology, and whether people like this term or not, or whether you agree with this term or not, I think it's fascinating. He calls it the part of the soul sciences.
Mhm.
And I'm like, oh, that is really, really fascinating, because it's not a science, right? Or again, like you said, maybe not, really proven scientifically, but there's this level um of connection that we can, utilizing it properly, like you said, and putting God first and not using it, predictively. There's this
Right.
level of like deep soul connection that we can have with God and with others and with ourselves, right? This try and with the world that he created. So that is so
Gorgeous.
beautiful. I love that. One last super quick question for you. Um, what do you I want to like circle back super briefly about this concept of like fate versus free will, and thinking about like the way astrology was used with like predictions and forecasts, and how it kind of had to be in a way because they didn't have like meteorologists right to like
Yeah.
explain things to them, right? um how do we reconcile with that now, where it's like we're okay with like no one bats an eye if a meteorologist gets on TV and tells us what's happening with this hurricane and has maps and has like tells us that like everyone knows that September and October, like beware, it's hurricane season, here's what's coming up. Like we know these things, we have the farmer's almanac, right? And there's a lot of truth that happens every year, right? I live in northern Minnesota, and people are constantly making forecasts and predictions of like, oh, if this happens in October, if this is the weather, we're going to have a really cold, hard winter, right? And so we're planning for that. No one bats an eye at that. At the end of the day, that is still forecasting and predicting. Like, how do we reconcile with like being okay with that, but not and this isn't me saying that we should use astrology for predictions at all. I also do not use astrology that way. But how can we reconcile with like being okay with forecasting and predicting things the way that we do now versus how bringing in astrology that way without taking God out of the picture?
We feel very comfortable as a society with anything that helps us survive,
Yeah.
right? Weather forecasts, right? Knowing what's going to happen this winter.
Mm-hmm.
How's the harvest going to be, right? When do I plant, right? Anything that has to do with helping us kind of get ahead as a species, as we should. We
Yeah.
should be paying attention to those things. We should be aware, and we should be permitted to read the signs of the sky when it comes to our survival. Something that we have forgotten about, though, is how important our spirit is, too. It's not just about our physical survival. What about our spiritual survival, right? And I think that that is why we're seeing again this resurgence in popularity of Christianity. Celebrities are converting in droves, right? People are looking for God. And what we oftentimes forget is that journey upward is ultimately an internal journey. We all know people who are at church, Wednesday and Sunday, who are leading Bible study, and they're a mess. Their homes are a mess. They're complete hypocrites, right? Their families, their children don't talk to them, right? We all know people like that. We can all point to those, incredibly sad circumstances. Why? It's because it's not about the external. The external is there to support us. Those external aspects of religion are there for us, right? To again, as support. However, the real work happens inside, right? It happens intuitively, it happens in our hearts and through the Holy Spirit working within us. And I know that we're at the end of our time, and so that's really what I want to leave us with, is that what I see as a theologian is that astrology, again, it is this language that we can use to speak to God, and during our time with God, which should not be predominantly or primarily focused on astrology. It should be a time of prayer, but using astrology as a part of that time to say, okay, what do you want to focus on with me? Or, if you're having an issue with your child, okay, what do they need from me? What is there? How did you create them? Give me the roadmap to this person. Give me the roadmap to myself so that I know where are my pitfalls, where are my strengths, and what did you put me here for? And so it gets to be kind of a second witness to that conversation. And I hope that our society is moving into, now that we've gotten pretty good at surviving physically, I'm hopeful that what we're witnessing is our society moving into, okay, now let's not only survive, but let's also thrive spiritually as well.
Yeah, I love that so much. Thank you, Janelle, for just kind of a history lesson. It's what I think so many people are going to be craving. Not a lot of people are willing to do this work and really do the research, and so we just thank you for doing it for us and sharing it with the world, and taking us through all of these beautiful examples of societies and cultures through the ages, and how really at the end of the day we are so similar, right, in so many. Thanks, Janelle.
Thank you, Rachel. I appreciate you.